Hi everybody, it's David Campany here for a talk on the William Klein exhibition. I'll just wait until the number of participants clicks up in the bottom of the screen. Just to say, we'll be together for about an hour, and at any point if you have questions you can type them into the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on those, and then I'll get to them towards the end. Great, we're up to 108 people. I'll just wait for a minute or so, and then we'll start. Hi everyone, welcome. We're just waiting for everyone to fill up, take your virtual seats, and then we'll get started. Just to say, we'll be together for about an hour, and if you've got questions at any point, just type them into the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on that, and I'll get to those towards the other end of the hour. As soon as I see the little number of participants kind of stabilize at the bottom, I'll start. It's clicking up. Great. So as they say in Zoom land, I'll share my screen. I've put some visuals together for you of the exhibition. So my name's David Campany, and for a number of years I was managing director of programs at the International Center of Photography in New York. Now I have a slightly different role. I'm a curator at large, so I'm based in London. And always with ICP, but far less frequently than I have been doing. So I've done 6 or 7 shows back to back over the last few years, the culmination of which is this big exhibition, William Klein, yes, photographs, paintings, films, 1948 to 2013. And it's actually pretty much reaching the end of its run. So we opened it at the beginning of summer in June, and it closes on September 12th. And it's the first time at ICP in its new location, which is on Essex Street, opened a brand new building just before the pandemic, so January 2020. And it's the first time really that the ICP's galleries and its school, has a renowned school of photography, and its library, pretty much everything it does apart from its collection, has an amazing collection of photography. Pretty much everything is now under one roof. On Essex Street. So if you get to New York, do go visit. And this is the first time we've done a show where one artist takes over the whole space, and it's a very big space. But Klein is a pretty big figure within the history of photography and film and painting and whatever else. So that was great for me as a curator to be able to just play with the whole space and see if I could tell a very complicated story of, if I just do the math there, looking at the dates, 65 years of work. William is still with us. He was born in 1928 on the edge of Harlem, New York. Got very interested in contemporary art as it was at the time in the early 40s. Used to visit Museum of Modern Art, got very interested in European art, European modernism. And after the war, 1946, he got himself to Germany, first of all, on a military reconstruction mission. But the aim was to get to Paris. That was the big kind of mythical place, as it was for lots of American would-be artists, writers in the 20s, 30s, 40s. So in a way, the show is something of a artistic homecoming for William, because he left New York in 46 and has lived in Paris all his life since then. He's made work in the US at a number of points, but it was always the place that that he left. Now, the interesting thing about Klein is that it's not one career, it's 4 or 5, 6 careers, all pursued at an extraordinary high level. They all kind of interweave with each other. So curatorially, that's quite a trick I have to pull off. You can't just throw all of that work at the visitor. You have to somehow narrate it and take people through his creative development, so you can draw out the different ways that he works and the different contexts that he works in. Because he made books, fiction films, documentary films, fashion work, painting, design. So it's a kind of complicated exercise to try and tell the story, but also I'm pulling together the different audiences for Klein. So some people know him primarily as a fashion photographer. He's a huge figure within experimental filmmaking. There are people that love the photo books that he made, the city books, and I'll come to those shortly. But there's not many people that really know the full range of the work. So that's another challenge that you're trying to pull on what people do know about Klein and introduce them to maybe what they don't know. I have a kind of a history with him. Back in 2012, so a decade ago, he had a big show at Tate Modern, and I ended up writing the text for his book, that show called William Klein ABC. I wasn't a curator at Tate or anything. It's a long story, but I ended up writing the book. So I got to know him at that point. Used to go over and visit him in Paris quite a lot. He then had a show called Paintings, etc., and they decided to do a book accompanying that. And then just of his abstract work, which I'll come back to. So I wrote the text for each of these books, and I always had it in the back of my mind that if the opportunity came up, I'd like to try and do a show. William is getting quite old now, and he's slowed down, he wouldn't mind me saying, over the last couple of years. So he didn't make it to New York, which was a little bit sad. It's really the first major show of his work that he's not been able to visit. But if you want to see he and I in conversation, we had one in 2013 at the Museum of Art and Design, I think it was, in New York. And Klein was his usual self, very forthcoming one moment and then not very forthcoming the other. So I was really on my toes, but you can see that we get on, and you can see that he's really articulate in the way he likes to talk about his work. Okay, so let's dive in. I'll give you lots of install shots. It's a big space, big walls, high ceilings, some double height spaces, some smaller spaces. And William has made work at lots of different scales. So from very small things, page-based things, up to very, very large prints. So just architecturally, spatially, ICP really suits it. You can tell straight away William has a certain way that he likes to do his shows. He doesn't like plain white walls very much. He likes the photographs to be clustered together around different kind of themes or geographies. And there's a lot to look at. So there's something like 300 works in the show altogether. Photographs, films, books, record covers, even storyboards, paintings. So I'll just give you a flavor of the layout and how the space feels. I absolutely adore curating shows for this space. It's just a thrill. The spaces are they're very large, but they're very adaptable, and we have a fantastic designer that we work with and a brilliant production crew. I think just the way it looks, I think this is probably our favorite show that we've done. On the upper floor, there's a screening room. I'll get to that a bit later with clips from William's films, his painted contact sheets there. And this is work from Brooklyn in 2013, which is the most recent work that's in the show. So I guess if people think of Klein, it's probably a combination of these kinds of pictures, very stylish fashion pictures, street photography, an interest in people and signage, a very strong design sense, graphic sense, maybe a relation to painting. So I'm always bearing that in mind, what people might know about Klein and what they might not. Now, it's an incredibly complicated career, and the intensity at which he worked, particularly from the kind of mid-50s through to the early 70s, the only kind of comparable artistic career I can actually think of in terms of how much got done and how far he got creatively. The only comparison I think I can make from that period is actually the Beatles. You know, when you look at the calendar of what the Beatles did pretty much every month, it's astonishing. And in my research, Klein's really working at that kind of pitch. So I'm going to simplify it and just tell you 3 different stories. But hopefully this will give you a kind of fairly full picture of what's going on in his work and what's going on in the show. So figurative painting to abstract photography. So when he arrives in Paris, he really wants to be an abstract, a figurative painter, first of all, and then turns towards abstract painting. A couple of his friends are abstract painters who went on to be very well-known abstract painters, people like Robert Motherwell. And he gets a chance to study in the studio of Léger, Fernand Léger. And Léger sees that Klein has this really strong graphic sense to his work. There are these kind of flattened all over compositions, which we know from his street photographs, which we'll come to a little bit later on, but that was already there in the paintings. Look, that's one of Léger's on the right there. So you get a sense of the kind of connection the two of them had. But Léger said, look, William, you've come here thinking it's Paris in the 20s or 30s, and it's not. Maybe think about getting out of the galleries, maybe think about architecture or design or new media. And he took that advice quite seriously. His first show was really of abstract and figurative painting. Here it is in a gallery in Milan, in Italy. And you can see on the wall there abstract works, figurative works. He's thinking about architectural placement, you know, like above the doorway openings there. And some of the paintings are small, but they were studies for what he hoped to make larger as murals. And that led to an invitation to make a room divider in an apartment in Milan. An architect was designing the apartment, asked William to make a room divider made out of rotating panels. So they were all on a kind of axis, and you could rotate these to make different combinations of these abstract paintings. William's quite young at the time, and he says, sure, yeah, I'll do it, which he did. And the story goes that when photographing them, Jeanne, who you can see, his wife, who we met on his first day in Paris, she's there looking out the window, top right. The story goes that she got a little bored, and while William was documenting these panels, she spun one of them. And in the long exposure, William saw a kind of abstract graphic energy, something kind of kinetic, a kind of blur that wasn't realist. It was produced as a kind of effect of this movement. And it sent him into the darkroom, and he spent most of 1952 not taking photographs, but just working completely abstractly in the darkroom. So he would have his photographic paper, and he would cut shapes in card, circles or slots, and would move that card over the photosensitive paper in the light of the enlarger. So he was sort of effectively drawing, making marks that you could see once you processed the film. And he got really good at this. He made hundreds and hundreds of them. He was very interested in the Bauhaus and the kind of artists and designers related to that. So that there's a little bit of that in the work for sure. And he made a book. He made a maquette, which wasn't published for decades and decades. He would once he had the photograms, as they're called, these abstract images, he would re-photograph them on negative. So he could then make prints of whatever size he liked, or just use details or bits of them. And I kept seeing this book on the floor of his apartment in Paris. And on the third time, I said, "What's that, William?" And he said, "Oh, that's nothing." And I knew that was something. So I went over and picked it up. And sure enough, it was this first attempt to make a book. Beautiful thing. And he's really working out graphically what you can do with the page. Full bleed, so the images are going all the way to the edges and into the gutter, into the spine of the book. And he's really learning what you can do graphically and just in terms of sequencing. An amazing thing. There's not really anything else like it in 1952. I wish he had published it at that point. It was, however, published, I think, around 2016, something like that, as the book Black and Light. Even that's quite hard to find now, I think. He started producing designs for Domus, the architecture and design magazine, book covers, magazine covers. There were also some record covers. And I've kept this room quite sparse, more sparse than you usually have in a William Klein show, because I know that it's going to get full on later on. So the first room is an introductory room, and you can really see his design sense. So you can get a feel of it. And he starts having shows of this abstract work, has one in Brussels in 53. And the following year, 54, he has one in Paris. And that show of abstract work in Paris gets seen by a guy called Alexander Lieberman, who was the art director of Vogue, American Vogue. But he was in Paris for the fashion shows. He sees this show, meets with Klein. Klein shows him more work, says to Klein, "Why don't you come back to New York, work at Vogue?" Now, he's never taken a fashion photograph. He's hardly taken a photograph. It's all been abstract. But Lieberman was an artist himself and decided that Klein's interest in kind of forging a new direction with this very strong visual sense would somehow work at Vogue in New York. So William and his wife Jeanne came back. So after 8 years away, they came back to New York. So he comes back really at the invitation to work on Vogue, the fashion magazine. But he says to Lieberman, "Look, I also want to take pictures on the streets of New York. So let me have an account with the local photography store for, film and paper and chemicals. I want to explore New York, the streets of New York." So he starts doing two things at once. He starts doing still life fashion photographs, which we'll come to a bit later, and street pictures. And he really throws himself into New York and ends up making a book with the great title, "Life is Good and Good for You in New York, Trance, Witness, Revels," 1956. With his candy-colored cover. Klein does the design of the cover. Some of these street photographs from New York are about as famous as you can get as street photographs. And it's amazing to think that they are really his first attempt at street photography. What you notice straight away is this enormous energy, a kind of kinetic energy, and a connection. And the connection is really important, and it's the secret to all of Klein's work, that he's never hiding. He's too interested in people. He wants to talk to them. He invites them into the little adventure, the little theater of making an image. So there's not really any voyeurism. There's not really, trying to grab a picture of people when they're not looking. That hardly happens in his work at all. I find it very ethical. It's connected, and it's present, and he's not hiding. These are examples of how he lays out the book. He likes all the mistakes, the blur, the misfocus, the out of focus, overexposure, underexposure. And he's really playing with what you can do with layout of the book. Nobody in America would publish the book, I think partly because it was graphically wild, but also you've seen there that he's very interested in Black life, Black urban experience, and he continues that interest throughout his life. And it's mid-50s America, remember. And I don't think American audiences were, certainly not American publishers, were ready for a book this mixed, this kind of cacophonous. And this is how he likes to show them in the gallery. So much bigger than a page size print. It's not classical, 8 by 10, 10 by 12. All these prints are made in the Klein studio they're all darkroom prints made in Paris. So they're not digital and they're not behind glass. He doesn't like anything that feels too much like a kind of stuffy, old-fashioned museum. So you move from that abstract room, you can see just behind there, that kind of whitish space, that's the abstract room. And then I plunge you straight into the New York street pictures in the same way that Klein has plunged into New York itself. And you'll see here, there are these screens for the major books that Klein made. So New York, Rome, Moscow, Tokyo. These books are now quite legendary. They're extraordinarily influential, have been since they were first published, but they're very hard to find. And as a curator, I don't like putting a book in a vitrine. It was okay with that abstract book that I showed you because there's only one of that, and I can't have it out on show for you to pick up. So we actually made videos of all of his major books and have them on these big screens. So they're not precious objects, but I know that lots of visitors really want to see those books and see every page. And we thought this was the best way to do it. Some of the graphics there from the book on the wall. 1958, he made his first film, which is called Broadway by Light. And he just points his camera at the lights of Broadway, the flashing bulbs and the neon. He showed it to Orson Welles, and Orson Welles said it was the first film that really needed to be in color, which is quite a compliment. It's now regarded as the first kind of pop art movie, but nobody really thought of it that way at the time. And that's on a huge screen with its slightly abstract instrumental soundtrack playing. So it's not a silent space. And as I said, he went on to plunge himself into Rome, Tokyo, and Moscow, making books about each of these cities. He does not just the photography, but the writing, the design, the covers. Extraordinary. This is how some of the pictures from Rome look in the space. And again, that little box plinth there in the foreground has a video of the Rome book. Some of the pictures from Moscow. Interestingly, that one on the right, well, they're both quite well known, those pictures, but the one on the right, curiously, when I was doing my research, I came across a British magazine from around 1960, which has an almost identical shot to the one on the right, but in color. Which I got very interested in because it's clear that Klein was shooting both, and the color ones sometimes appeared in magazines, but the black and white was kept for his books. Moscow bleeds into the work from Tokyo because the books were published in the same year, 1964. And we have a slideshow of around 400 images of all taken in one day on Klein's last day in Tokyo, following a Buto dance troupe, a kind of avant-garde dance troupe. He starts photographing them in their rehearsal space in the morning, takes them out into the street, and they improvise various actions, gestures for him and also for crowds that gather at various points. This is the first time this slideshow has been presented outside of Japan, which is a bit of a thrill. An image that he took in a hairdresser's studio in '64. I keep being asked what's my favorite Klein picture. It's probably this one. I just think it's a kind of miracle of observation and framing and composition. You could zoom in and make 30 different shots within that shot. And when you see it in the book, which is quite big, full bleed, double spread, it's such a kind of immersive image. You're really plunged in there. He was in West Africa in the early 60s. There he is on Independence Day, Dakar, Senegal. And he's getting a sense of a kind of Black independence movement that's spreading its way, or had been spreading its way across various African countries. And he's very interested in this. And there's a connection that he makes with his early experience of Black life in New York in the 50s. He's made a number of documentaries at this point, and he gets a chance to make a film about the young Cassius Clay, the boxer, who later changes his name to Muhammad Ali. And he gets on a flight from New York to Miami, where Clay is due to have a fight, finds himself sitting next to Malcolm X. Klein and Malcolm X become good friends. Malcolm is the kind of mentor to Cassius Clay, so Malcolm gets him really good access to Clay, and just makes this absolutely electrifying documentary about the young boxer. You see him training, sparring with the camera, improvised rapping, and that film plays all over Africa, as well as America. Pretty much anywhere that will screen a film, project a film, on the side of a building, is showing the Cassius Clay movie. And it's really that movie that makes Clay this kind of international sporting superstar, but also a kind of figurehead of a new kind of Black independent consciousness. And because that film played all over Africa, Klein got invited to make a film about a 24-hour event in Algiers called the Pan-African Festival of Algiers, where Black independence politicians, activists, philosophers, writers, musicians, dance troupes, theater troupes, all gathered in Algiers for a 24-hour celebration all over the city. Klein coordinated several camera operators to film everything that was going on. And then he cut this film with no voiceover. So as you watch the film, it's like a collage of experiences as he hops you around the city. Interesting, Algeria had a really thriving independent filmmaking scene of its own, but Klein was the guy that gets hired to do it. And while he's there, he meets Eldridge Cleaver, who is the Minister of Information for the Black Panthers. He's on the run from the FBI. And Klein, on the spot, decides that he wants to make a film about Cleaver. So they spend 3 days together. Klein cuts a kind of film portrait about him where he espouses his philosophy and about his take on Black experience in America and what needs to happen to overcome the situation. And the ticket prices are kept very low. So a kind of young Black audience is able to go see it. And half the profits went to the Black Panthers, which scandalized the American film industry, made the cover of Variety magazine even. And then years later, he gets a chance to make a film about Little Richard, who is the kind of gender non-conforming pioneer of rock and roll in the 50s. He's not exactly washed up in 1980, but he's pretty much off the radar. He's actually selling Bibles at this point for a kind of white couple. Meets him, they get on, and Klein wants to tell the Little Richard story. He feels it is the American story. Maybe America doesn't want to hear it, but it is the American story. So they start making a movie together to tell his life story. Halfway through the shooting, Little Richard disappears. And Klein is left with half a movie. What's he going to do? he goes to Hollywood and he organizes auditions. 400 people audition to play the part of Little Richard, including a young white woman. And Klein says, "What are you doing here? This is for the part of Little Richard." And she says, "Well, you know, it's Hollywood. You never know." He casts various people, and then the second half of the film has these amazing lookalikes that have got their outfits and their impressions, you know, completely down pat. So extraordinary piece of spontaneous, almost kind of guerrilla filmmaking. And it shows Klein at his best, immersed in the lives of people, but also, you know, on his feet, problem solving, finding ways to do things. Okay, pretty breathless, as you can tell. Now let's trace another arc from what happens when he gets to America, back to like 1954. So as I said, he goes back to America in 54 at the invitation of Alex Lieberman from Vogue. And he has a chance to become a fashion photographer, which he's never thought about doing. I mean, he's seen fashion pictures, but it's not something that burned in him. But, you know, he has this great sense of style. He has this way of interacting with people. Actually, his first appearance in Vogue is not fashion work at all. It's just him, a kind of showcase for him as an artist, really, the new photographic eye, William Klein. He doesn't get to work with models, the famous models from the 50s and 60s, doesn't get to work with them for a while. He's doing fashion still life, so usually with an 8x10 camera, color film, extremely controlled, and Klein has to make quite boring things interesting. So Lieberman is kind of testing him in a way. Some of the still lives, you can tell there's an influence from Irving Penn, and of course Irving Penn and Richard Avedon, who was primarily not at Vogue but at Harper's Bazaar. They were the kind of reigning, you know, kings of fashion photography. But William had to find his own way of doing things. This is some of his darkroom trickery here. This shot, very famous now, actually taken on the roof of Avedon's studio. Klein was working with the models in the studio down below, got very, very bored and said, let's go up to the roof, improvise something. They're all in their outfits. They bring the dressing mirrors and they improvise this like little kind of hall of mirrors scene with the New York skyline in the background. Interesting to see how they cropped it there. Also on the far right, that's Nena von Schlebrugger. That's she was the mother of Uma Thurman, the actress. That's the full frame. So that's what Klein likes to show in an exhibition. So interesting to see what Vogue did with it there in the cropping. And there's a very big print of it in the show. So there's a very long, long wall, 60 feet, 70 feet, something like that, a kind of chronology of his fashion pictures. More street photos. You can see that there's a kind of irony and a sense of play. The gestures are all quite exaggerated. And this really comes out of Klein slightly mocking fashion while he's involved in it, but he's also collaborating with the models and they are deciding quite often the kind of poses or suggesting the poses they want to strike. So again, it's a much more kind of fluid, connected relationship. If any of you have questions as I'm going, you can type them into the Q&A and I'll get to them pretty soon. So I didn't want, again, to have lots of, you know, open copies of old Vogue magazine in glass cases. So we have the photographs on a wall, on a long wall, and then there's a screen, just a flat screen with something like 70 or 80 of his most sort of representative spreads from Vogue. Seemed to me like the best way to do it, rather than have, you know, endless kind of curved magazines. The strange thing about Vogue from that era is they were all stapled So they're actually very hard to show in a case because they don't open flat. So showing them on a screen seemed the best way to do it. Interestingly, this one was taken not far from ICP on Delancey Street, and the storefront was painted pink for this fashion shoot. And in fact, the guy in the window there was tasked with painting it. And Klein said, well, come on, you've painted it. I want you in the frame. So he sits in the window there of this empty barber shop. When Vogue publishes it, they crop him off, interestingly, and just leave the white models. Here he's working with long exposures. Somebody stands behind the model with colored flashlight. So there's a little kind of connection with his early abstract work there. And he makes a film about fashion. Who are you, Polly Magoo? Qui êtes-vous, Polly Magoo? Which I think is the best. It's the most cutting, but also the most genuine film about the fashion industry and what it does to people. A model called Dorothy McGowan, who you've seen in some of the photos already. She plays Polly Magoo, this young woman who is kind of plucked to be the new face of that year, and she's slightly manipulated, and so it's quite a dark portrait of the fashion industry and its deceptions and its vanities. Interesting that Klein was kind of working at the heart of that industry, but because he never really wanted to do it. I mean, he found he could do it and he was very able to. He always feels he never took it completely seriously. He was always slightly outside of it. I always have this feeling that Klein's a kind of insider and an outsider at the same time. He's a street photographer, but he doesn't really do street photography like anyone else. He's a fashion photographer, but then he also makes this satirical film about the fashion industry. I think artistically, kind of in and out is a good position to be in. In fact, in the book that's coming out quite soon called Yes, my essay in there, which tells the story of his life, is called Insider Outsider. And I do think that's an interesting way to think about it. Some frames here from Who Are You, Polly Magoo? I don't know if anyone knows the filmmaker and publisher Chris Marker, French, Chris Marker. He was the one that got the New York book published in Paris, exactly the way Klein wanted it. And they remained very good friends. And Chris Marker said of Klein's films, he said, if you stop a Klein film anywhere, you actually have a Klein photograph. You know, all these crazy vectors, this complex layers, glances, gestures firing off in all these different directions. Interesting. It makes his films incredibly rich to watch, especially if you're a photographer, you want to stop them. So I've just kind of grabbed some frames for you from Who Are You, Polly Magoo? And upstairs in the space, we have a kind of show reel with clips from, I think around 10 or 12 of his films, his fiction films and also his documentary films. And they are surrounded by film stills, storyboards, posters. So there's a whole floor dedicated just to the films, really. And we organized a number of film seasons of Klein's work with local cinemas, so Metrograph and also the Anthology Film Archives. They've both been showing seasons of Klein's films, and I've been introducing some of those when I've been in New York. And there's a book coming soon. It's been a bit delayed because it's so giant, but it'll be with us soon. And I don't know that if there could ever be a definitive Klein publication. I don't think there could ever be a definitive Klein show. Although this exhibition that I've done is pretty big, I could have filled a space 5 times the size. So the book, as I said, has this long kind of biographical essay, sort of telling the story of his creative life, really, from the time he gets to Paris to the present. And between him and the studio and I, we worked out a sequence of his pictures, including lots that have not been seen before. So that's coming soon from Thames and Hudson. Well, that was pretty breathless, I know. There are some questions. If I come out of that, I can pick up the questions. Anyone has questions, just type them in and I'll try to get to them. Eric Miles. Oh, hello, Eric. A couple of bits from Minor White's review of New York. Quote, Klein did not photograph a city. He matched with cheap, sensational photography the vulgarity of life in all its ugliness. People squirm through the book like Gustave Doré's illustrations of the Inferno. But Dante's Inferno here is only a pile of angleworms loving the rut. Animal living is photographed full tide with barely a moment of lyricism, none of beauty and tragedy, only a match struck on the seat of the pants. Can you comment on Klein's relationship to the fine art photo establishment, Minor White, Beaumont Newell in the 50s? Yeah, I can comment on that, Eric. It's a good point. And I don't think it was fully appreciated at the time. He was mirroring back New York as he saw it after 8 years away in all of its, well, on the one hand, you have this kind of money obsessed, consumer obsessed, fame obsessed world. Architecturally and at the level of infrastructure, the city's falling apart. He kind of described it as a slum, but he sees this just enormous ebullience and sense of persistence and people just getting on with their lives. Minor White was making, highly poetic, slightly melancholy images of rocks and curtains and some portraits. There was a kind of preciousness about American fine art photography at the time. I don't think even the world of street photography quite knew what to do with Klein, because he wasn't a voyeur, he wasn't trying to slip through the world, like a Robert Frank or a Cartier-Bresson. His pictures are upfront about their own theater and their own artifice. He's talking to people, he's inviting them to pose or flirt or whatever it is, to show their anger or their humor or whatever it is. And I think this was just too much for people. Plus he was a filmmaker, plus he was a fashion photographer. And I think people found it difficult. He's also quite a big personality. He's not quiet. He's sensitive and he's thoughtful, but there's nothing demure about him. And there's nothing pretentious about him. The American fine art establishment did not take to him very much. He had a show at MoMA, I think around 1980, but it was 15 prints and a slideshow. There was a show at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art just about his New York work from 54 and 55, which I think was in the 90s. 1994, ICP itself did a show mainly about the fashion work, called In and Out of Fashion. This is the first time there's been a major show in America, so I knew I was bringing the work back to the place that William had left, and also the place that had never quite embraced him at the time. That New York book has never really been published in America, certainly not the way it was first published. Good question. Thanks, Eric. Laura. Hi, Laura. does Klein himself have preferred groups, themes in his work? Yeah, he likes to show it by city, the street pictures, for sure. He likes to show the fashion work as one thing. He likes to show the painted contact sheets, which I didn't really go into, as one thing. My initial scheme, right at the very, very beginning, was to just make it chronological, maybe do away with those groupings. So you could see that, let's say in 1964, he's making the Cassius Clay movie. He's also publishing the books on Tokyo and Moscow. He's also a fashion photographer at the height of his powers. My initial idea was to make it absolutely chronological, so you could see what he's juggling at any given point. But it's too much. It was too much. I do that in the essay in the book. I take you through year by year, sometimes month by month, so you can see what his working life was actually like. But as a show, it was too much. It was too just to tell the creative life as it was lived as a show is too chaotic. It does work in book form, but it doesn't in the show. So yeah, what you've seen, there are 10 numbered sections to the show, and I've taken you through pretty much all of them, and they are how William likes to do it. So I do have to follow his guidelines. William likes to curate his own shows. We weren't going to do it that way, so we worked it out. We would then show it to William. He would make some suggestions. His studio would make some suggestions, and we arrived at it. Like that. Thanks, Laura. Graham Land, many thanks, David. Excellent exposure of Klein's creative style, passion and interest. What do you feel was your greatest challenge in presenting such a range of work? Would you say Klein's practice is difficult to define, confine? Hope your exhibition travels. Yeah, I hope it travels too. He is difficult to define. That's true. I think there's more of an acceptance now of multi-talented image makers who worked in different forms in different contexts. And I think for a while, the kind of standard sort of 20th century modernist take is that an artist should be just doing one thing, or they shouldn't be doing too many things. And I think this kind of blocked people from understanding Klein because he was just doing so much, trying everything, which is why the show is called Yes, because he took invitations and he tried things. I think probably the closest comparison on that level is actually Gordon Parks, the African-American photographer, filmmaker, fashion photographer, painter, poet. Parks was also extremely successful in his own time, but I don't think ever had quite the recognition that maybe he even has now. And I think it's taken people a long time to accept the range of Parks's talents. I think it kind of blocked people from understanding him. It's a bit scary when an artist is good at so many different things. It kind of puts people off in a way. Museums don't know quite how to handle it. Art writers don't know how to handle it. I think they do now. I think there's more of an acceptance of that now, but it does make it a challenge to get that across without just throwing the range of the work back at the viewer. You do have to do a little shaping of it so that it doesn't get too overwhelming. But you could see from those big install shots that it just visually it is quite an overwhelming show. Thanks, Graham. Deborah Brown. Hi, Debbie. Was Vogue the only magazine that published Klein's fashion work at the time? Yes, but they were also in French Vogue and English Vogue. His work did appear in other magazines, but more kind of documentary work. So he worked for a magazine called Town, which is a very pioneering, interesting magazine based in London. And he went all over the UK. There are Klein pictures from the Shetland Islands, can you imagine? Or Wales. Imagine those kind of Klein compositions, but they're in those kind of landscapes. They're amazing. I didn't have space for those in the show, unfortunately. And he's in quite a lot of art magazines and design magazines at the time, but primarily the fashion work is in Vogue. He goes away from fashion sort of end of the 60s, actually comes back to it in the 90s and 2000s and does some work for Harper's Bazaar. But really at the time, 50s and 60s, it was the various different Vogues are there. Tell us about the title of the exhibition, please. Well, I touched on that briefly. That was William's idea. I had the technical subtitle worked out, paintings, photographs, films, 1948 to 2013. William wanted to call it Yes, and he even mocked up a kind of design for it at the beginning. I said, why do you want to call it Yes? And he said, well, because I said yes. Things happened. Alex Lieberman extended an invitation. He got an invitation to shoot the Pan-African Festival of Algiers. He got an invitation to make that, rotating room divider abstract painting. He said yes whenever he could, partly to kind of push himself, I think, partly just a kind of confidence. Yeah, I can do it, even though he's never done it before. But also, if you say yes, you don't know what it's going to lead to. So you might be saying yes to that one thing, and you try your best to do that one thing, but it might lead to other things. So he did always try to say yes, not always, but I think there's a kind of spirit of yes, even in the photographs. There's a kind of positivity to it, even though they're very realist pictures. He's not putting a kind of glossy spin on anything, but he's saying yes to life. And he's saying yes to the kind of photographic moment and the encounter with people. Sometimes there's an anger there. Sometimes there's maybe a sarcasm or something satirical. But there's an enormous positive appetite for people and the circumstances that they find themselves in. That's the long answer, but yeah, yes covers a lot of that. Any chance it will, Kevin says, any chance the exhibition might come to the UK? Probably not, because there was this big show at Tate Modern in 2012. We're working on trying to tour it. It's complicated, also we're just coming out of the pandemic, and there are complicated logistical things with traveling shows, and it would be nice. I don't rule anything out. Robin Morris. Hello, Robin. Would Klein have had any interaction with Robert Frank, another pioneering photographer at the time? You could do a whole show about the parallel between the two of them, photographers who are also filmmakers making work at the same time. Klein is the American who goes to Europe. Frank was Swiss, who comes to America in 47, and Klein has gone to Europe in 46. There are amazing, extraordinary parallels. I actually posted about it on Instagram. You'll have to go through a few days back through my Instagram. But in 1955, I think, they were both assigned to photograph the same high society party in New York. Klein photographed it for Vogue, although Vogue didn't publish it, and Frank photographed it for Harper's Bazaar. And each of the pictures that they took appeared in their books. So Klein's picture of that society party appears in his book, New York, and Robert Frank's picture from that same party appears in The Americans, which was published in 58, 59. Apparently, on the contact sheets, on Robert Frank's contact sheets from that evening, you can see Klein in the background, interestingly. There is a picture that I showed in passing. I don't know if anyone remembers, street photograph in New York with a woman's face filling most of the frame, out of focus. And the focus is on the crowd of people behind. Frank took an incredibly similar shot the same year called Movie Premiere Los Angeles, I think, where Frank focuses through the kind of classic 50s starlet. You can't even recognize who it is. She's out of focus. Focuses on the crowd gathered at the everyday looking people gathered looking at her. So there are some amazing kind of visual similarities. I think their dispositions were very different. I always think of a certain kind of melancholy in, sort of poetic melancholy in Frank, who I admire just as much, but it's very different. You barely get any melancholy in Klein. There's much more of a kind of exuberance, and there's as much of a debt to kind of sort of Dada and pop art in Klein as anything, I think. And of course, they went on to make films. Why is Liliana's asking about the title of the show? Is Mr. Klein still taking photos today? Yeah, he does occasionally. Works with the digital camera. He likes iPhones. We've had conversations about iPhones. I thought the last body of work that I wanted in the show were those Brooklyn pictures, which I showed you briefly in color from 2013. There's not been a kind of fully formed body of work made after that point, although he's always been making pictures. Alice, hello Alice. Love your in and out description of Klein. For your information, the Klein exhibit at ICP in 1994 was indeed called William Klein, In and Out of Fashion. Thanks. Alice Zimmet was involved with ICP and managed to get the sponsorship for that show. So thanks, Alice. Justine, fascinating, David. When is the book out? I've heard it's October, although I did just glance at Amazon just before I came online and it says February, so I cannot give you a fixed date for that. There's a big world paper shortage at the moment, and it's a very large book with quite a big print run. So let's just be happy when it gets here. It's a little frustrating. I wrote it back in May 21, May of last year. So it's a slow process, but the book is there for the record. So once it's here, it's here. Patterson Tracy says, hi, David, wonderful insight into Klein's work. Thank you. Wondering if this recording will be available online. Yes, I think it will through Photo London. Ava, what's your thinking behind the word? Yes, I think we've covered that, Ava. Nikki Caro, did Klein share his work experience onto other young, growing photographers? Yeah, in a kind of informal way. Lots of photographers have kind of passed through his studio as assistants over the years. He's always been interested in what younger generations do, because he's always just been so forward thinking, and he was always a kind of rule breaker. And I think he'd hate to see his own work turn into a set of rules. So he's, in conversations over the years, yeah, he's often talked about, you know, the future being way more interesting than the past. So that puts him on the side of youth, I think, rather than old age. Many thanks, David. It's a fascinating presentation. I wish I could visit. Ah, well, a few days left. September 12th, it finishes. Vincenzo, is there a possibility of his major town books being republished? Well, if I look up on my shelf, Tokyo was republished. I know Rome was republished. My dream would be to see Moscow back in print. And the biggest dream would be to see the New York book as it was first published, the 1956 version, in print, almost like a facsimile. That's the book everybody really wants to see. Klein has always been resistant to that, quite restless. There have been subsequent books about New York, but he's reworked it, he's changed the designs, but that absolute you know, seismic bomb that went off when he published that influenced so many photographers. I could do a whole talk just about the influence of that book. That's what people really want to see, and that book is quite hard to find. Sorry, I was glancing up at my copy of New York. I nearly raced over to pull it down and show you. I showed you some spreads from it. So yeah, that's the one that's escaping the kind of original version of the 1956 New York book. Oliver Godot. Hi, David. So great. So honestly, straightforward question. How did Paris perceive his New York appearance, New York City appearance and work at the time? Did it push his Paris work thereafter? That's a really good question. French audiences were much more interested in it because the French saw the kind of mythology of America, because American culture was just post-war was being exported everywhere through music and through film, through literature to an extent, mainly through film. And I think there was an interest in the kind of pricking of that sort of propaganda bubble about America. And you definitely get that feeling in the Klein's New York pictures from the 50s. Interestingly, although he lived in New York from 1948, he didn't in Paris, lived in Paris from 1948. He didn't do a book about Paris until the early 2000s. He was invited to. And in that book, he says, well, you know, I was always resistant to it because people want something very different from a Paris book. They want romantic, watery, black and white, poetic, monocultural, he says in the book. He says, I found Paris to be more ethnically, culturally diverse and mixed and dynamic than even New York. And you just don't see that in Paris books. Everyone wants a romantic Paris. So while the French were interested in the non-romantic America, they weren't very interested in a realistic portrait of Paris. So when Klein finally did do a Paris book, it's called Paris plus Klein, or Klein plus Paris, I can't remember. You see its political mix, its racial tensions, its economic tensions, that they're all in there. And it's his response to Paris, but it's also his response to the kind of classic Parisian, you know, photo book. Yanis, congratulations for this exhibition and the book. Great work. The insider-outsider mentality you mentioned, I feel, is common with many modern photographers such as Walker Evans, Gordon Parks, Gary Winogrand. Is this because of the political ideologies in their eras, or maybe because they wanted to make a living on the side while making art? Could you please comment more about this mentality? Yeah, I think about that a lot, Yanis. I think you're largely right in those different ways that you framed it. I think photography is, because photography shows, but it doesn't explain very well, I think it's actually very good at expressing mixed feelings, complicated feelings. I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to be making of any of Klein's pictures or Walker Evans's pictures or Gary Winogrand's pictures. They're not messages, they're complicated, and they come from a complicated, layered place. Plus, a photographer is the other side of a lens. And you can think of the lens as a kind of portal that joins you to the world and is a kind of passport. It'll get you into interesting places and in front of interesting things. But it's also a kind of wall, separates you. You're never entirely part of what you're photographing. You're slightly separated. So I think it's kind of built into the apparatus, the insider outsider. So I don't know. I can't do a kind of one psychoanalytic reading of all photographers. But from my years involved with photographers, there is a kind of commonality there of connection and separation. It might be that it's useful, helpful to be making pictures. It also might just be a useful way to navigate the world while keeping your sanity, you know, the way Klein did in the world of fashion, being an insider and an outsider. Gosh, that's making me think hard, that question, Yanis. Not sure how much further I can take it. Yana says, speaking of Robert Frank, do you think there may have been a chance that Klein and Frank may have influenced each other? I think they're certainly aware of each other. There are some moments in print where Klein he skirts around it. He's not positive about Frank, but he's not particularly negative either. I think he understands their differences. I think he was aware that Frank was embraced in America. I think because of that melancholy edge, the way Klein wasn't. I'll leave it there. I'll get into hot water with that one. It's difficult. Adam, hello, Adam. One of the best interviews I've ever seen was with Klein and yourself a few years ago at Photo London. Klein swerved so many questions to talk about biscuits. It was a great evening. Yeah, it was. I had to be on my toes there. That's the last time we did something together in public. Mark says, not surprised he wanted to curate your show. Yes, he did. I workshopped with him and Larry Clark, who was Klein's tennis opponent, after class in the late 80s, and brought my copy of the Aperture book, which compiled the city books for a signature. However, Klein hated that book. Yeah, he did hate that book. And he did not have final say editorially, and so refused to sign that title. Yeah, he did have a bad experience with that. However, as students, that was all we could get our hands on. Very spontaneous and independent. He would grab students' cameras and start taking pictures with it. Yeah, that sounds like him. Yeah, he didn't like that Aperture book for one reason or another. He does like control. I don't blame him. I don't like the way artists get described as being controlling, as if that's a negative thing. You'd never say that of a novelist. Oh, they like to control their words on the page. Yeah, that's what they do. I think because there's an idea that photographers sort of are supposed to, professionally, they often hand over their work to others who do things with them, you know, layout, editorial choices, captions. I think when you get someone who's got a very strong sense of what they do want to do, I think it's easy to think of controlling being a negative thing, and I don't think it is. I think it's great. They know what they want to do. That's a good thing. Of course, I as a curator had to negotiate all of that, but that's fine. I don't mind controlling. Katya, hi Katya. Interesting how established photographers like Klein or Moriyama switch to digital while young photographers are heavily shooting film. Do you have any thoughts on this? Yeah, I do have some thoughts on it. I think because there was always an interest in reaction and spontaneity and taking pictures within the flow of life that you get with Klein and with Moriyama. I think they embrace the digital because the slowness of film, its sensitivity compared with digital, the cost of it, changing rolls of film every 36 frames, all of that was just a pain. It was a real pain in the ass, you know. So as soon as the digital came along, wow, it was extraordinary. The things you can do, amazing. It's true, a lot of younger photographers have an acquired nostalgia for the analog. They never experienced the analog when it was around, but they think that it's somehow more serious or something. I don't buy that. I don't rule out anyone doing anything with any medium, analog or digital at all. But I sense that in your question there, Katya, that there's a slight disconnect between those older photographers wanting to push on with the digital and younger ones embracing the analog. I love the digital. I mean, I was just thrilled when it arrived. So exciting. Good. We've gone slightly over our hour, folks. Oh, there's one more question. Melinda, brilliant. The work and the exhibit. Eager to see it. Thank you, David. Melinda, thanks, Melinda. That's a good ending. Great. It's nearly 10 past the hour here, so I've kept you too long. I've got to go and have dinner with my daughters. So I'll say goodbye at this point. Thanks for joining, everybody. And thanks for all your questions. Bye.